Why do successful organizations fail? And it's an interesting question, right? Because it's fairly obvious why a bad organization that's poorly run with, say, maybe bad employees or bad managers, why that would fail. But why a successful organization with great leaders, great employees, great managers, why that would fail is a lot less obvious. And yet, if you look through the sweep of history, certainly business history, but even that of nations, it's what we see over and over again. The organization, the company, the country that once is at the top, a generation or two later are invariably in the middle of the pack or the bottom of the heap. The question is, why do we see this over and over again? And as Professor Christensen studied this problem, he reached the most counterintuitive conclusion for someone at the Harvard Business School, which was it was the very principles of good management taught at places like Harvard that, while helpful on the way up, ultimately spelled every organization's demise. Inconvenient for a Harvard Business School professor to conclude, perhaps, but nevertheless what he did. And these theories to explain this phenomenon became known as the disruptive innovation theories. So what we did when we wrote this book was to say, what are the root causes of why schools struggle? And if we stand from the outside, which is different obviously from what most education researchers do, and put these theories on like a set of lenses and look through the school's struggles through that light, what can we see about suggesting ways for schools and the education system in this country to transform itself, to reinvent itself, and yes, to innovate, to turn the system into a fundamentally student-centric one that can work for any student regardless of circumstance. Remember the early personal computers? Remember them sitting down, early 1980s, you'd start typing, and every once in a while you'd have to stop and coax the stupid thing to catch up with you on the word processor. I see some head nods. Yeah? That's because the basic Intel 286 chip inside those machines wasn't even good enough for an application like word processing. But true to form, Intel improved that chip year over year and marched straight up that blue line to the point where they pack in so many features now and they introduce multi-core, Pentium, whatever processors that greatly outstrip the needs of an ordinary user like myself. In 1970s and 80s, there was a company up in Massachusetts where I used to live until a few months ago called Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC. Some of you may remember DEC. They built mini computers, which were not actually particularly small, but they were smaller than the dominant technology at the time called mainframe computers. But they were about the size of this podium here. And Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC, was the most successful company of its time, sort of the Google of the 1970s and 80s. And you'd go to the popular press and you'd say, you know, why are these guys so good? And you'd be reading an article and they'd say, DEC just has the best managers, best leaders in the world. They make the right decisions year over year over year. But an interesting thing happened around 1989, same time actually that Clay Christensen entered academia, which was that DEC's business just collapsed within 6 months, really quickly, just fell off a cliff. And so you'd go back to the popular press and say, well, what happened now? And they'd say, those stupid managers, very same people. They didn't see the personal computer coming. If they had, they would have changed the world. But they just didn't catch it. Why do smart managers decide to become stupid? But it didn't make sense in this particular case, even though it's the dominant narrative we always read about, right? Because every single mini computer business just fell off a cliff in the exact same 6-month period. And while you might expect businesses to collude on price occasionally, to collude to collapse was a bit of a stretch of the imagination.